that doesn't really matter. Again, the similarity to the third world is very close. Back in this is what's called economic health, and when this happens, you call it an economic miracle, another technical term. So, for example, Brazil was a terrific economic miracle under the neo-Nazi generals that we installed with great self-adulation back in the 60s. And by 1971, it had become the Latin American darling of the business community. And the president, the general who ran the place, pointed out that the economy is doing fine. It's just that the people aren't. We have a Nobel Prize winner who just won the Nobel Prize last time, Robert Lucas of Chicago. And he was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal and said, "We've been doing great and have been for a long time." He didn't even bother to add what the Brazilian general did. It's only the people who aren't doing well. What he means by we is the top 5% or maybe top 10%, and that's right. We've been doing great, we're doing fine, the economy's fine. By now, we don't even worry about the fact that the people aren't doing so well. Like, I won't bother repeating the statistics, which you know, and he knows perfectly well. Okay, that's economic miracles. We're now beginning to get one ourselves. What about privatization? Well, again, the effects of that are obvious. So, say, in the latest economic miracle in Mexico, privatization meant, as usual, handing over public assets to friends of the president or other rich people or international investors at a fraction of their cost. And in fact, in Mexico, the number of billionaires during the economic miracle went up even faster than the percentage of people on the poverty line, as some were doing well and the people didn't happen to be doing so well. In fact, it was a catastrophe for them, even before the collapse. So that's privatization. What about property rights? Increase of property rights. That's very important. In fact, it's a critical aspect of the what are called misleadingly the free trade agreements, which actually have strong protectionist elements in them, Uruguay Round and NAFTA and so on. And one of them is increase of intellectual property rights. I won't go into the details, but what it amounts to is guaranteeing that major corporations have a monopoly on the technology and knowledge of the future. And they extended those by various devices so that it's about 50 years before you can interfere with owned property, which comes from public subsidy, usually through research, and then is handed over to some private corporation, and nobody else is allowed to touch it. So increasing property rights has a big effect, highly protectionist measure, which is central to the new trade agreements, and has a long-lasting effect way down the road on organizing the international economy and who gains and who loses. Last element of the Washington Consensus is reducing trade barriers. And here there's another scam that you ought to keep your eyes on. What's called trade in economics is a very odd notion. So, for example, if Ford Motor Company moves parts from Indiana to Illinois for assembly and then moves them back to Indiana, that's not called trade. But if Ford Motor Company takes parts made in Indiana and moves them across the border to Mexico, where you can get much cheaper labor and you don't have to worry about pollution and so on, and they get reassembled in Mexico and then sent back to, say, Illinois for value added, that's called exports and imports. Never had anything to do with the Mexican economy, or in fact any economy. It was all internal to the Ford Motor Company, but it's exports and imports. So how big an element is that? Well, about 50% of U.S. trade. So about 50% of what's called U.S. trade is actually internal to individual corporations, meaning controlled by a very visible hand with all sorts of methods around for distortion of markets and robbery and so on and so forth. And it's about the same for Japan. And for the world, it's hard to get numbers, but what's estimated for the world is around 40% of trade. Agreements like, say, the Uruguay Round, GATT, if that increases what's called trade, what it actually does is increase investor rights. That is, it increases the power of transnational corporations. You have to really look pretty closely to figure out what the effect is on trade in any meaningful sense. For example, it may increase cross-border operations, but decrease trade in a meaningful sense of trade, meaning something that's not under the control of kind of corporate mercantilism. Going on with this, it's perhaps worth noticing that the very concept of capitalism and markets has virtually disappeared. So, for example, if you take the current issue of Foreign Affairs, there's an article by Joseph Nye of the Kennedy School, I think maybe he's the dean of the Kennedy School, who explains that there's a big new weapon in the hands of American diplomats. American diplomacy, he says, diplomacy has a force multiplier. And the reason is because of the attraction of democracy and free market enthusiasms of the United States. Those things have given the U.S. a real force multiplier. And then he spells it out. It comes from Cold War investments in high technology, electronics, aviation, telecommunications, and so on. That's our free market enthusiasms and democracy. Well, where did electronics and aviation and telecommunications come from? Well, from public funds. They didn't have anything to do with the free market. They came from public funds, which were transferred to high technology industry under the conscious guise, deceit of security, and it was conscious. So Truman's first Secretary of the Air Force, back in 1948, pointed out to Congress that the word to use is not subsidy. The word to use is security. And in fact, the whole system was designed that way and stays that way. So that's the tribute to democracy and the free markets. Tribute to democracy and free markets is you rob the public by deceit to enrich the rich. That's free markets and democracy. And it's published without comment. Another article and probably nobody notices, because the concept of capitalism, just like the concept of democracy, is just gone. Nobody knows what it is. Democracy means deceive people into doing what the rich people want, and markets means make sure the public subsidize the rich. Or to take another example, take say the Wall Street Journal, which you'd think would be the last holdout where somebody remembers what capitalism is. Well, they had a front lead article a couple of weeks ago on various strategies that states, meaning like states of the Union, were using to try to be more business friendly. And they picked two examples, Virginia and Maryland, who are sort of competing and to see who can most sponsor entrepreneurial values and be most business friendly and so on. And they said, well, for a while it looked like they have somewhat different strategies. That's why they were describing them. For a while Maryland was doing better, then it turned out Virginia's doing better. Now Virginia's doing better. They're more business friendly, more gung-ho about business and so on. All right, you read the article. Turns out it's not Virginia and Maryland. What it is the suburbs of Washington, some of which are in Virginia and the others of which are in Maryland. And what are the two business strategies, entrepreneurial strategies? Well, the suburbs of Washington figured they could rip off the National Institute of Health and others develop biology-based industries. They were looking for biotechnology and so on. They figured that's going to be the big cash cow. And Virginia, which is more business-friendly, decided that the old cash cow, the Pentagon, would probably be the best way to rip off public funds. So they were concentrating on electronics and telecommunications and so on. And it turned out that Virginia had the better strategy, the better business strategy. They made a better guess about which public funds to rob. And that's what it means to have entrepreneurial values. And it's, again, reported without comment. This just continues virtually without a break. The New York, I'll give you one last example. The New Yorker had a rather good article, actually. By now the story about what's happening to the economy and to the population, which used to be what crazies on the left talked about, it's now sort of hit the public. So you read it in the newspapers. New Yorker had an article in which they reviewed the figures on decline of real wages and increase in profits, and the story you're familiar with. By a guy named Thomas Cassidy. It wasn't a bad article, actually, sort of reviewed the familiar facts. And then he ended up by saying, look, no one's to blame for this. It's just the market in its infinite and mysterious wisdom just has these effects, and there's nothing you can do about it. And they gave exactly three examples in the article of the market in its infinite and mysterious wisdom, namely Grumman, McDonnell Douglas, and Hughes Aircraft. Maybe this is some kind of subtle irony that I'm missing, but these are three prototypes of publicly subsidized corporations. Grumman, Hughes, McDonnell Douglas, they wouldn't exist for 2 minutes if it wasn't for a huge public subsidy. So that's the market and its infinite and mysterious wisdom. When Clinton was announcing his grand vision of the free market future at the APEC conference in Seattle, he did the same thing. It was in the Boeing terminal. That's where he announced it. And he gave Boeing as the example of the grand vision of the free market future, and there are big headlines in all the newspapers, a lot of applause about our love of the free market and so on. It's unnecessary to comment. But it is kind of interesting. What it means is that the concept of capitalism and markets has disappeared as fully as the concept of democracy, which is an interesting fact about the modern period, and a kind of a natural effect of applying the Washington Consensus at home, because you really have to drive out any understanding of what's going on, namely that it's really existing free markets that are being imposed. Well, all of these current measures share one fundamental principle, and I think it's really at the heart of it. Two related fundamental principles. One is they transfer wealth to the wealthy, and the second is they transfer decision-making power to the wealthy. So all of them have the effect, just think through, every one of them has the effect of putting more power to make decisions into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, what we call corporations, basically totalitarian institutions, but they're mostly unaccountable. And that's the effect. You think through the examples. Every case of the Washington Consensus applied at home has exactly this effect. And a good part of the propaganda system has the same goal, in this case, surely conscious. So the propaganda system is designed, has been for years, to demonize unions, which makes a lot of sense. Unions are a democratizing force in which the mass, one of the few ways in which the large mass of the population can pool limited resources and work together for some common good. So that's that bad thing, democracy. So naturally you want to demonize and destroy unions, and that's been going on forever. And the other leading propaganda theme, and I don't mean by that, just what you hear in the newspaper, reading the newspaper and so on, like the entertainment industry and television and everything else, is anti-politics, meaning setting up a picture. It's called anti-politics. The picture is a very specific kind of anti-politics. You have to establish the image, get into people's heads that the government is the enemy, federal government. State governments are okay because they can be sort of controlled by business anyway, so it doesn't matter. But the federal government's sometimes a little too big to be pushed around, so it's the enemy, and it cannot be. Nobody can dream of the possibility that the government is of, by, and for the people. That's impossible. It's an enemy to be hated and feared. Not that there aren't a lot of things wrong with it, but that's not, what's wrong with it from their point of view is that it has a big defect. It's potentially influenceable by the population and big enough to stand up against private power, and that's the defect. So you have to regard it as the enemy. It cannot be of, by, and for the people. It's a kind of a them versus us business. This is them is the government, which is the enemy. Us is all of us nice people, sober working man, loyal wife, maybe extra job these days, the hard-working executive toiling 20 hours a day, for the benefit of all, the friendly banker who's out there trying to find, give you money. That's us, And then there's them. Them is the outsiders, the un-Americans, the agitators, union organizers, big government, and so on, and sort of us versus them. That's the picture. That has been rammed into people's heads for at least 50 or 60 years by intensive propaganda everywhere. Movies, television, textbooks, just constant. And not by accident. This part is all extremely conscious. We have a huge public relations industry which spends billions of dollars a year on exactly this sort of thing, and consciously they even tell you about it. Well, why is it happening now, not say 30 years ago? One proposal is it's the market and its mysterious wisdom. We can put that aside. This is perfectly conscious social policy and also hence under social control. Second is we live in lean and mean times. We got to tighten our belts. Complete nonsense. I mean, all I have to do is look at the business press. They're just ecstatic, and have been for years. Business Week just came out a couple of days ago with the annual issue on the top 1,000 corporations. The headline is 1995 was one for the books. America's most America's most valuable companies grew even more valuable by a record 35%. That's these lean and mean times we're in. Another headline in Business Week reads, "The problem now, what to do with all that cash," as the coffers of corporate America are overflowing with surging profits. Another one talks about the government, really great government. It says, "The Gingrich Congress represents a milestone for business. Never before have so many goodies been showered so enthusiastically on America's entrepreneurs." The headline of that one, incidentally, is "Return to the Trenches." You know, like we got to ask more. Feeding frenzy has to go on from the nanny state. Fortune magazine, you know, the other big business journal, I mean, they can't even find the adjectives in the last couple of years to describe what's going on. One year it's dazzling, you know, the next year stupendous. I mean, I'm waiting for the Fortune 500 issue, see what adjectives they come out with next week. What they've been double-digit profit growth for unheralded 4 years with pretty stagnant sales and fortunately wages going down. CEO salaries are going through the roof, and it's uncorrelated with performance. It's another interesting aspect of it. There have been now studies of it, so just some other thing, has nothing to do with markets or anything else. And meanwhile, wages continue to decline, as does family income and so on. Well, you know, nobody who even looks at the business press can believe that there are lean and mean times. As I said, the country is just awash with capital. Their problem is they don't know what to do with it, so therefore get more. You know. Another theme that's around now is you have to have what's called downsizing in order to be competitive. Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics came out with its figures up to last year. They have them for 1993. From 1983 to 1993, the category of executives, managers, and administrative personnel grew 30%. Okay, that's downsizing. The fastest growing white-collar population happens to be security guard. Well, yeah, that's connected with turning it into a third world country. You take a walk down San Salvador, you know, you'll see plenty of security guards. You know, rich people have to be protected. And furthermore, all these prisons you're throwing people into, they need security guards. So yeah, they're administrative personnel, and that's increasing, but so are same in corporations. There's no downsizing going on, except for working people. That's quite different. Why is it happening now? Anyway, let's go back to why it's happening now. Well, the fact is it's always going on, just depending on the weapons at hand. American business particularly, is highly class conscious and very open about it, incidentally. And it's always fighting a bitter class war. You go back a century ago into what were called the gay 90s, when incidentally the international economy was about the international economy was pretty much as like it is now in terms of capital flows and so on. It hasn't become more globalized in terms of trade and capital flow and so on than it was then, may even be less so. About a century ago, it looked as if the game was over. You know, they were talking about the end of history, perfection had been reached, in the devil take the hindmost society where everybody's for themselves and enrich yourselves and so on. It was monstrous for working people. Very brutal, in fact, here. That was a century ago. Well, it didn't end. You know, in Europe particularly, the social contract was slowly imposed, not easily. It didn't happen here. By the Roaring Twenties, as they were called, labor had no voice. This is the age of mass production and automobiles and so on. Labor was out of it. It was a business-run society almost completely, and it looked permanent. Again, you know, utopia of the masters, end of history, all this talk. The 1930s, it proved to be wrong. There was a lot of popular organizing, popular protest. It rammed through elements of the social contract that had been achieved in Europe decades earlier, and that just caused hysteria in the business community. You read the business press, it was talking about, you know, the hazard facing manufacturers and the rising political power of the masses and how we're going to face disaster unless we figure out some way to reverse this and control their minds and control them and so on. A huge propaganda campaign began right after the Wagner Act was passed, 1935. In the next 2 years, the National Association of Manufacturers, its public relations budget multiplied by a factor of 20. You know, as they recognized that force alone is not going to be enough. The U.S. has a very violent labor history, and plenty of workers were getting killed, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be enough. They had to have huge propaganda. It was sort of put on, that's when all this harmony business that I was talking about got designed. It was a specific design as to how to carry out what they called scientific methods of strike breaking by controlling communities and so on. Well, it was put on hold during the war, and then it picked up right after the Second World War was over with an enormous propaganda campaign. I mean, you can't believe the scale until you look at it. And the purpose was very explicit. The purpose was to win the everlasting battle for the minds of men, which have to be indoctrinated with the capitalist story as we sell our preferred way of life, and on and on. These are all just quotes from mainstream PR literature. And it was very substantial and aimed precisely at what I described. They describe what they're doing, and you can see it in the propaganda, the schools, the entertainment industry, everything else. Well, what happened in the 1970s? What happened is there were some changes in the international economy and in technology and so on, which just put new weapons into the hands of the masters. One crucial factor, which everyone points to, is an enormous growth in financial capital, financial transactions. It just boomed, short-range financial transactions. That came about partly because of the dismantling of the post-war Bretton Woods system of regulated currencies, which kind of made currencies free-floating. The Nixon administration just dismantled it. Partly it came about for technical reasons. I mean, the telecommunications revolution, which was, of course, publicly subsidized, at that point made it possible to transfer funds very rapidly. So like you can, by now it's estimated around $1 trillion a day, just shift up and back from one market to another, very short-term transactions, all and at and aimed at something. They're all aimed at low growth and high profits and low wages. And that is a factor that's driving policy in that direction. I don't think it's by any means an uncontrollable factor, but it's definitely a factor. And that's just put a lot, and the changes are in the composition of capital transactions are very striking. From about maybe the time when you have data, like late 19th century up till about 1970, rough estimate was that about 90% of capital transfers had to do with the real economy, with investment and trade, 10% speculation. By 1990, the figures had reversed. By 1995, the latest UNCTAD, UN Economic Commission estimate was about 5% real economy, 95% speculation, short-term speculation like against currencies, which is essentially aimed at driving down growth and increasing profits and lowering wages. This was understood very quickly by the late 70s, and there were proposals made, for example, by James Tobin, the Yale economist, Nobel Prize winner at an American Economic Association presidential address, 1978, simply suggested a simple reform: low tax, very low tax on short-term financial transactions, just to slow it down, throw a little sand in the gears. Probably work. It's been called the Tobin tax, but it's not getting anywhere because the weapon is a very important one. That weapon has been used very efficiently for all the purposes that have been described, and there are other things. Is it out of control? Is there nothing we can do? Well, there's no reason to believe that. I mean, elementary reforms, like, say, the Tobin tax, could have maybe a big effect. Furthermore, more globally, all of these interchanges, as I mentioned, the international economy is not more integrated by most measures than it was 100 years ago, in fact, less in many respects. And the transactions that are going on are mostly within the big three regions, United States, Japan, and Europe. Now, that's under political control. That's not out of political control. Democratic societies in these three areas could control this. The idea that it's somehow, kind of impossible to control all over the world, that's just not true. You look at the flows, they're internal to the highly developed, rich societies, where theoretically there are democratic governments and could impose all sorts of restrictions. Furthermore, all the talk about corporate greed and everything is really crucially beside the point, in my point of view, I think, and should be recognized as a very big regression from what working people and a lot of others understood very well a century ago. Talk about corporate greed is nonsense. Corporations are greedy by their nature. There's no such, they're nothing else. They're instruments for interfering with markets to maximize profit and wealth and market control. You can't make them more or less greedy. I mean, maybe you can sort of force them to be. It's like taking a totalitarian state and saying be less brutal. Well, yeah, maybe you can get a totalitarian state to be less brutal, but that's not the point. The point is not to get a tyranny to be less brutal, but to get rid of it. Now, like 150 years ago, that was understood. I mean, if you read the labor press, there was a very lively labor press right around here, Lowell and Lawrence and places like that around the mid-19th century, run by artisans and what they call factory girls, young women from the farms who were working there. And they weren't asking the autocracy to be less brutal. They were saying, get rid of it. And in fact, that makes perfect sense. These are human institutions. There's nothing graven in stone about them. They were created early in this century with their present powers. They come from the same intellectual roots as the other modern forms of totalitarianism, namely Stalinism and fascism, and they have no more legitimacy than they do. So it's not let's try and make the autocracy less brutal if that's the short-term possibility, but we should have the sophistication of, say, factory girls in Lowell 150 years ago and recognize that this is just degrading and intolerable, and that, as they put it, those who work in the mills should own them, and on to everything else, and that's democracy. You don't have that, you don't have democracy. Okay.